Welcome to Rail Families United. As we explore the issues pertaining to the players that are involved in rail issues, clearly one of the key players is the U.S. Surface Transportation Board. And although a lot of the issues which I discuss on my channel, Rail Families United, and also at my other channel on the UPNS Merger, originate in Canada, many of the rail executives involved have escaped to U.S. Class 1 rail carriers. And so as we look at issues now where we're looking to have major companies like Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern merge, well, the channel that I have on the Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger clearly argues against allowing this merger to go ahead. And that's based on the years of research that I have done looking at what is making the rail industry exponentially more dangerous. And there can be no doubt that deadly training materials, rail executives who violate laws that are there to protect frontline rail workers, regulators that choose to turn a blind eye to so many violations of laws, and on and on and on. So as we look into all these issues, clearly one of the key players that we have to look at is also the U.S. Surface Transportation Board. And so that's what this video will focus on, is what information has been provided to the U.S. Surface Transportation Board. Information that might impact the current merger talks between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, as the U.S. Surface Transportation Board is the board that decides whether or not to allow that merger. So what have they known behind the scenes and have not revealed to many of the rail families, which would include frontline rail workers, rail investors, rail customers, and the public at large, as well as taxpayers? Are they another group that is sweeping issues under the carpet? That's going to be a very serious question as we move forward. Okay, if you look at this screen print here, this is a screen print. At the very top, you can see that these are for emails that I sent to the Surface Transportation Board in the U.S. And at the very bottom there, you can see that there's one that says TCI/CN CEO Jim Vena is out. Jim Vena was supposed to be one of the people in the running to become the likely next CEO of CN Rail back in 2021, when an activist investor by the name of TCI tried to take over the board of CN Rail. And when I saw that happen, when you try to take over a board, all stockholders basically have to vote on that, and so there has to be proxy votes sent out, there has to be legal teams. It's a very involved process to try to take over the board of like a major rail carriers. So when that happened, I started emailing the legal team for TCI, which was the activist investor trying to put Jim Vena as CEO of CN Rail. Okay, so what you have here is a screen print from an email which was entitled CN and CP Rail Woes. And that email was sent out. You can see here the date on the right-hand side was in 2021, November 19th, 2021. And basically the people on this distribution list were lawyers and a few others that I was communicating with at the time. But the lawyers for TCI, which was trying to take over the board of CN Rail and put Jim Vena in as CEO of CN, that's who I was communicating with, because I'm an MA in finance, and there is one thing that I understand, and that is that investors, they will run from a nasty rail scandal. And so if you look at the bottom here, the bottom arrow says all legal teams for TCI will again want to read this very carefully. And I had been basically sending them information and telling them Jim Vena was Chief Operations Officer when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. And there's no way that man would not have known that they were violating the law when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. And so, if you're a legal firm and you have this information being sent to you, will you keep pushing for Jim Vena to be CEO of CN Rail? Because, again, if you have to have a proxy vote and you're asking stockholders to vote on whether or not to put Jim Vena in as CEO, are you going to be pushing for that to happen? Are you going to have anything to do with that? If you are a big legal team in New York, are you going to have anything to do with pushing to have Jim Vena put in as CEO? If you know, hey, there might be some really big issues here, failure to disclose a material fact to investors, well, it may not just be TCI that would get sued, but maybe your big law firm, if you choose to push him forward and have anything to do with this, if you've been given information telling you there's some serious problems with TCI's choice for the next CN Rail CEO. And so, again, look at the date here, was November 19th, 2021. That's when I had sent this to them. And, all the Canadian regulators were also getting a ton of emails, like they've been getting emails for years. And so, Dave Seglins, that guy works for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is part of the government of Canada. It is the propaganda arm, the taxpayer-funded news broadcaster in Canada. And so, again, there were more than enough people in Canada who knew Jim Vena was absolutely also a problem, and that I would be doing what I needed to do to make sure this man did not become CEO of CN Rail. After all the research I had done, there was enough documentation to show that the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney was a complete and total cover-up, that CN Rail was violating numerous laws, including the Railway Safety Act, when that young man was killed, and other laws. So, again, if you're a law firm in New York and you are part of this process trying to take over a board, are you going to risk getting sued as you continue to play a role in this public scam? Probably not. So again, I was talking or sending emails to the lawyers for TCI when TCI was trying to take over the board of CN Rail back in 2021. And some of those lawyers were in New York, others were in Ottawa. And so, if you're a lawyer in Ottawa, are you going to phone the government of Canada and say, hey, is this really true what this person's telling us? Probably. But anyway, you can see here that Jim Vena withdrew as a candidate for CN CEO, and that was announced on December of 2021. So about a month after I started communicating with those legal teams and putting pressure in the background to make sure that Jim Vena would not become the CEO of CN Rail. Okay, so again, at the bottom here, you could see the email where I was emailing TCI lawyers on their choice at TCI of putting Jim Vena as CEO, and that he was taken out. After that, I focused and sent some emails to the Surface Transportation Board regarding the CPKC merger. And, that was happening mainly in the States, and I did send quite a bit of information to the Surface Transportation Board. And it was only in a you can see some of the other emails here because I pulled up what had to do with Jim Vena here in the Surface Transportation Board. But you can see the emails at the top we're in 2023, in July of 2023, just a few days before Jim Vena was basically announced as the CEO of Union Pacific. You know, it shouldn't be my job to keep track of all these rail executives moving around. Why aren't the regulators preventing some of these guys from assuming new roles, you know, that they're going behind the scenes and getting new massive roles in the rail industry? You know, why aren't they being blocked by regulators? How is it that Jim Vena could become the CEO of Union Pacific, knowing what the government of Canada knew, knowing what the Surface Transportation Board knew, and whatever? I mean, I only caught the issue with Jim Vena becoming CEO of Union Pacific a few days literally before that was announced. And I tried to tell them he cannot be the Union Pacific CEO, but it was really virtually too late. Obviously, the decision had already been made and it was just a matter of announcing it. But, you know, is it my job to regulate or to, you know, have to do the investigation and at the Surface Transportation Board or regulators in Canada to have to prevent some of these guys from assuming these roles when regulators knew there were serious problems? It's not me that's not doing my job. It's the regulators. And that is clear in both Canada and the US. So that's all I'm going to say on that one right now, but we're going to keep going and you'll see more as far as the Surface Transportation Board. All right, so on this slide here, you can see how Jim Vena was announced as the Union Pacific CEO on July 26th of 2023, and that's in an article by Reuters. But again, you can see at the bottom on the left where I had only noticed that on July 23rd, 2023, that he was in the running. And so the likelihood of them even reading this email at the Surface Transportation Board, you know, within a couple of days of this being announced, you know, how do you block it? And they should have been able to block this a lot sooner when it came to even having this guy in the running, given the information that had been given to the Surface Transportation Safety Board, dating as far back as 2021, 2022, and whatever. So again, where's the procedure to have checks and balances for who's allowed to become a CEO in the rail industry when there's serious concerns that get raised? Okay, so again, this email here was showing that Jim Vena was out of the running in December of 2021. But you can see here at the bottom, well, at the top you can see these were emails for the Surface Transportation Board. But at the bottom here, the date is 2023. November of 2023 is when I really started pelting the Surface Transportation Board with a lot of other documentation. And so, you know, you have to ask yourself, again, it's not just Jim Vena, it's also Claude Mongeau at Norfolk Southern. How was it that that man was allowed to become the chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern, given the information I had given to the Surface Transportation Board, that he was CEO when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed? And there can be no denying that that death was a complete and total cover-up. So if you look here at the bottom, okay, there's a document here that I had sent to the Surface Transportation Board, and it was called Index of Documents. That's a 15-page document. And in that, I provide a summary of basically all the files, like all these files I had sent to them. And I think I sent them like over 2,000 pages, probably between 2,000 and 2,500 pages of documentation. And basically telling them, before you approve any mergers, you better read this information. Okay, and I had also sent this information to Senators Ron Johnson, who was chair of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and also to Chuck Grassley. But, you know, again, it wasn't their role to be doing rail stuff. That was the Surface Transportation Board, and it should have been the Department of Transportation in the U.S., the Secretary of Transportation. I don't know who that was. That was the Biden administration. Buttigieg, I guess. I don't know if he was there the whole time. But anyways, you know, I'm busy dealing with scandals in Canada, trying to protect Canadian rail workers, and it's almost as if now I also have to worry about all the U.S. rail workforce too, because the Surface Transportation Board is not doing its job. Well, yeah, they're there for mergers and acquisitions and whatever, but somebody needs to do the role of, hey, wait a minute, if there's a problem with a rail executive, there needs to be some mechanism in place to block these rail executives who really should be removed from the rail industry, in my humble opinion. And that does not seem to exist in the US or in Canada. In Canada, it's because they're rail partners in crime. In the US, I don't know. Has, you know, has there been death cover-ups in the States? If it's anything like in Canada, probably. And I'm hoping that as we delve into these issues and do the dissection of a rail worker death investigation and look at all the issues that played into this, all the violations of laws, the players, etc., that if there's one thing that comes out of this, it is that rail families in both countries, Canada and the US, will pay much greater attention and be much more critical of reports that are put out as railway death investigation reports. Learn to look for the lies. Know the laws. Learn to look for the lies in these reports. Know the players, and so on. We need to have a lot more eyes looking into these reports when it comes to deaths in the rail industry. But again, how did Claude Mongeau become chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern? Please explain that to me, because that should never have been allowed to happen. Had regulators in Canada been doing their jobs, they should never have allowed Claude Mongeau to escape to the US and become part of the rail industry and such a key player in the rail industry. All right, so this is just a page here that I had from the document entitled Index of Documents, which I had provided to the Surface Transportation Board and other regulators. Just these first two paragraphs are just the introduction. After that, it's basically an Excel spreadsheet that shows the document name, the number of pages, and here's a description of what this document provides. And so, again, I had given them about 2,000 to 2,500 pages to look at. So if they had done their jobs and actually read that information, would, Jim Vena have been allowed to become CEO of Union Pacific? Would Claude Mongeau have been allowed to become chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern? Whose job is it to look into these issues and prevent that? Now, if you look here, I was basically, this had to do with, when I first did this document, it was during the CN Rail Board takeover by TCI. And I was basically saying, well, there's two of your candidates that you want to put on that board that I have huge issues with. One was Jim Vena, and the other one was Paul Miller, who was the VP of Safety at the time for CN Rail when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. So, if you're VP of Safety, you're supposed to be there to ensure that the programs and the policies are in place to keep the work environment safe for rail workers and whatever. So, were you doing compliance audits as VP of Safety to make sure your employees were properly trained, had all the training they needed to have, that laws were being followed? Were you doing compliance audits as the VP of Safety? I guess that would be my question. But it's not just VP of Safety. There are so many roles, in my opinion, at CN Rail, including VP of Marketing. For example, Jean-Jacques Ruet would become, a CEO at CN Rail. He was VP of Marketing. Okay, well, if you own hotels at CN Rail or at CP Rail, and geez, we have a lot of trainees and we keep churning our workforce, so our hotels are being booked by CN Rail for lodging its trainees during training sessions in class at our convention centers, etc. Okay, well, that's propping up the marketing and the sales arm and convention center facilities revenues for CN Rail, and you could do the same thing at CP Rail. So, are we churning the workforce in order to, because that helps prop up that part of the balance sheet? And, conductor trainee, trainees and newly qualified conductors, they're a lot cheaper than a full-time rail worker. And so if we keep churning the workforce, keep getting a new bunch in, we bring them into our hotels, you know, they need rooms, they need food, convention center facilities, whatever. So I'm an ME in finance. And when I see this type of stuff, to me, that is, you know, playing the balance sheet game, right? That's just my humble opinion. But so there's more than just the VP of safety role that, in my opinion, plays into this, because the VP of marketing should have seen that the workforce was being churned at CN Rail. You're not going to tell me that it takes thousands of conductor trainees to come up with a few hundred that are going to fit the bill and be able to be kept. Why is it that so many conductor trainees, shortly after they're qualified, while they're still on probation and subject to dismissal, they get dismissed, they get fired, within 6 months of being hired, or a year? Well, because it's a lot cheaper to bring in new conductor trainees, put them through our facilities, put them through our programs. Why aren't you, if these conductor trainees or newly qualified conductors aren't doing the jobs they're supposed to be doing, if they have still some problems, why aren't you spending just a little bit of extra money to address the shortcomings in their training and make sure that they are working properly? Why this constant revolving door? In my opinion, it was to save money, and it also dilutes the union's power, because you basically have nobody sticking around that knows anything in the rail industry if you're constantly churning the workforce. And the union may or may not realize it, but in my opinion, that is diluting the power of the union to represent rail workers too. But anyways, so there's a lot of issues here, but just know this index of documents, and all these documents did go to the Surface Transportation Board. So they have plenty of information to know that there's certain issues that should have been flagged as big red flags when it came to certain rail executives that were moving around in the U.S. rail industry. And if it wasn't their job to address those issues, did the Surface Transportation Board refer those issues to the proper authorities? And if not, why not? Did you refer or flag Jim Vena or Claude Mongeau, and there's others, to, investigative bodies that could look into these issues? If not, why not? That's my question. Now, again, this is a copy of an email that was sent to the Surface Transportation Board. And again, this one was during the CPKC merger. And the three files here at the bottom on So Much So Wrong, those files clearly show the issue of deadly training materials being used at CN Rail. And I did a whole series on deadly training materials and practices and field practices at CN Rail. And that was not just under Jim Vena. That was also under Keith Creel, who is now the CEO of CPKC. And he was CEO in 2007 during the Mac Yard incident. And I'm going to get into a whole lot more on that. But that incident clearly showed fake qualifications for frontline rail workers, so much so that the then Minister of Transportation issued a Railway Safety Act Section 19 order forcing rail carriers in Canada to completely overhaul the frontline rail worker training programs. And that little exercise ended up being a total public scam, in my humble opinion. And I get into that in other videos that I'm going to be doing. But the government of Canada knows that I've done all of this investigation and documented it all. Now I'm just doing the videos for it. But, I would encourage people to look at the series on my channel for Rail Families United, the entire series on deadly training materials and field practices. A lot of that, folks, that was done under Keith Creel while he was Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail. And so again, if you're seeing that there's all these issues with this rail executive, in this case it would have been Keith Creel, should that guy be allowed to become a CEO at CPKC? Should he be allowed to be the CEO of another big law or another big rail carrier in the US and in Canada? And when you got rail partners in crime who have your back in Canada, that they're not going to disclose all your wrongdoing because they were a party to it, there's huge issues with that. In my opinion, the liabilities for the government of Canada and all these rail executives are massive. And now it's just gotten exponentially worse as these companies are allowed to merge and these rail executives have more power, bigger and bigger roles in both Canada and the US. And so it's just a total nightmare, in my humble opinion. And a lot of it should have been stopped by regulators, either in Canada or in the US. Now, when I would submit stuff to the Surface Transportation Board in the States, I would get these emails back basically saying, oh, you need to go to this and submit your information for the formal filing for CPKC, for example, for that merger, in this specific format, the specific filing guidelines, whatever. And, there's a real problem with that because my issue was not with the merger itself at the time. It was with one of the players, a key player. In this case, it was Keith Creel. And so they're asking me, go through the formal process. And there's issues with that because here I am documenting some very ugly stuff. And I have a child to protect in the rail industry. And I'm not about to make public, because I wasn't ready at the time, all of the information I wanted to make public pertaining to some of these players because I had to document them better. And so, again, where are the procedures for addressing issues with specific executives? When there's a problem and somebody needs to flag something to stop these people from being key rail executives in the US or, part of mergers or chairman of the board, whatever. I mean, that's not my job. I'm the mother of a rail worker. There needs to be methods and procedures in place for things that maybe can't be part of the official record, but need to be part of the off the record record. So, again, this is just an absolutely huge issue. For the Surface Transportation Board to just reply to me with its generic, go through these forms, go through this website and submit your information as part of the formal filings. No, I have a child to protect, and my issue at the time was not the merger itself. It was with certain persons involved in the rail industry at CP Rail, namely, again, Keith Creel, but I have issues with others. Jeffrey Hare, for example, and there's probably others, but those two, for sure, off the top of my head, I would have had huge issues with allowing them to be part of a larger CPKC merger. So anyways, that's all I'm going to say on that one. Before I go on here, there's one other issue I want to bring up, and it's this issue with the Surface Transportation Board telling me that please note that any formal filings must be served on all parties of record. Well, that would have included CP Rail Executive Keith Creel, and I didn't know if the Government of Canada was investigating Keith Creel for past wrongdoing. My suspicion would have been no, given the rail partners in crime as far as turning a blind eye to a lot of violations of the law dating back to at least 2007. But, again, I'm there to protect frontline rail workers and to try and bring issues to the forefront for regulators in the U.S. And to tell me, oh, you got to give all your information basically to Keith Creel? No, I don't. I'm sorry, but I don't. I'm not there to give Keith Creel ammunition against me and or my family. Um, and, you know, I have no doubt that this is going to get big and ugly and nasty, but my issues are well documented. That's all I can say. Now, you can see in this email where I basically told the Surface Transportation Board that you're going to have to consider what I'm submitting to you off the record if that's what you need to do in order to determine whether or not this merger should go through and what basically whether or not you should be allowing CN or CP to have a larger footprint in the U.S. rail industry. That was my concern. Not the specific merger with CP and KC, but giving CP a bigger footprint in the U.S. or CN a bigger footprint in the U.S. rail industry, given the operational excellence under Jim Vena and Keith Creel while they were at CN Rail. And also while Keith Creel was CEO of CP Rail, there's a railway investigation report where I looked at um, an incident where you had basically three managers at the control in the locomotive. And I look at what their qualifications were. Um, when CP put those three guys in the locomotive. And it's pretty flabbergasting. So that's going to be another video that I'm going to be providing. But I was just trying to tell the Surface Transportation Board, you don't need the type of operational excellence as you would get from the likes of Jim Vena and, in my opinion, also Keith Creel in the U.S. rail industry. You don't need a larger footprint of that type of operational excellence is what I was trying to tell them. And again, there's going to be a lot more videos on that I need to provide, but the analysis has been done. It's been given to regulators in Canada and to the Surface Transportation Board. So how these mergers keep happening, and now we're looking at a Norfolk Southern and UP merger involving Jim Vena, better put on the brakes is all I can say. And every locomotive had better be blowing its horn to, act as a whistleblower to stop things like this from happening, mergers like this involving these players. That's all I can say on that matter. There needs to be some serious braking here going on at the Surface Transportation Board so that these issues can be properly investigated and addressed before allowing this merger with UP and Norfolk Southern to move forward. Okay, so before I move on from this particular slide, what I want to show you here, I want you to notice the date of this email to the Surface Transportation Board. It was dated January of 2022, and one of the files that had been provided, and again, I had provided them enough information. They had 2,000 to probably 2,500 pages of documentation that had gone to the Surface Transportation Board. But the file that I specifically want to point out here is the one called Visual, which had been sent in January of 2022 to the Surface Transportation Board. That is the file where I take the railway investigation report tied to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, and I marked it all up with red ink. This is a scan of that file marked up in red ink that went to the Surface Transportation Board. And they knew, and they had been told, that Jim Vena was the Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed, and that death was a complete and total cover-up, and that there is no way, as Chief Operations Officer, that Jim Vena would not have known that this cover-up, that this death was a total cover-up, and that CN was violating numerous laws when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. And so, again, where are the checks and balances at the Surface Transportation Board to prevent someone like Jim Vena from becoming CEO at Union Pacific and now potentially the CEO of a merged Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern? In my opinion, there's no excuse for allowing things like this to fall through the cracks. There should be, files on key rail executives at the Surface Transportation Board and, Department of Transportation, whatever, to prevent something like this from happening. Jim Vena should never have been allowed based on the information that was given to the Surface Transportation Board, he should never, and to the Federal Railway Administration, he should never have been allowed to become Union Pacific CEO, in my humble opinion. Okay, now this just shows again some of the key files that ended up going to the Surface Transportation Board. Again, you can see that in my email. I had done a search here for files and emails that went to the Surface Transportation Board, but you know, this is proof that they received all these files. These were all files that were part of that index of document, the 2,000 to 2,500 pages that went to the Surface Transportation Board. And so there's no excuse, in my humble opinion, for allowing CN or CP Rail to have a larger footprint in the U.S. rail industry by allowing mergers that involve some of these rail executives, given their past operational excellence at CN Rail, because there are some massive issues when it comes to their operational excellence. And to allow that to be, you know, to infest the U.S. rail industry, you know, just getting rid of Jim Vena at Union Pacific, it's not going to solve the problem. He's been there for years. He's had the opportunity to infest the U.S. rail industries with his operational excellence. And so even if you removed him, where are the compliance audits? You know, looking at his operational excellence and his cost cutting to see whether or not things are being done that need to be done, proper maintenance, proper training of frontline rail workers. Where are all the compliance audits that should be done to see what's really going on behind the scenes in the rail industry in both Canada and the US? Okay, and again, just more files here. This one, eye-popping certifications. Again, this would have been stuff that was done well, Jim Vena was at CN Rail, and likely some of it would have been under Keith Creel too. But, you know, again, where are the compliance audits by regulators? Keith Creel has also been a CEO now at CPKC for years. And, you know, he's had the opportunity to infest and I use the word infest, that's the word I choose to use. He's had the chance to infest the U.S. rail industry with his operational excellence. And again, there's going to be a lot of files that I'm going to be showing, or videos documenting those issues. And some of them date back to his days at Chief Operations Officer back in 2007 when they had the Mackyard incident. So there's a lot of issues. And by the way, when I show all these files, I have no doubt that there's going to be some rail carriers that are going to be doing freedom of information requests and whatever to the Surface Transportation Board, to the Government of Canada, wanting my emails, wanting my intellectual property. This is my analysis. I did this to protect my child and to protect frontline rail workers. I did not do it to give it to the likes of Jim Vena, Claude Mongeau, or Keith Creel, or whomever to protect themselves in any potential lawsuits. This is my intellectual property. The Government of Canada and the Government of the US do not have my permission to give it to rail executives. They don't have that right. This is my information. So that's all I'm going to say on that one. All right, so there's several more emails over the years that went to the Surface Transportation Board and also to the Federal Railway Administration. And yes, I can absolutely prove that. If I tell you that I've sent them emails, if I tell you I've sent them over 2,000 pages, you can trust me, I've sent them over 2,000 pages. So in my opinion, the Surface Transportation Board needs to do its job. It needs to look at the issues, and there needs to be compliance audits before you rubber stamp, you know, a merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. Somebody needs to do compliance audits to see what's been going on as far as proper training for frontline rail workers, what's been going on as far as proper maintenance, and so on. when you are a publicly traded company, as these rail companies are, you have a duty to investors. When you sign off, I'm an MA in finance, and I'm a U.S. citizen. I may be born in Canada, but I am a U.S. citizen. And, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the U.S., when you sign off on your financial reports, as the CEO would have to do, and that would mean Jim Vena, it would mean Keith Creel, it would have meant, also Claude Mongeau when he was CEO at CN Rail, because CN is also traded in the US. So when you sign off on your financial statements, you have to sign basically saying that you are in compliance with all laws under which you operate. Well, clearly, in the case of CN and CP Rail, when Jim Vena, Keith Creel, Claude Mongeau, and others were there, that was clearly not happening. And so, folks, when you're telling rail investors, well, we're in compliance with all our laws, we operate totally within the law, and that's a lie. And it can absolutely be shown to be a lie, as we show via the dissection of a rail worker death investigation pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney. When you look at all the issues that I've uncovered, the deadly training materials and field practices, all of the issues with players, and the U.S. Surface Transportation Board is now a player because of this merger that would involve Jim Vena and others. But there's other players. And the fact that a player may be in Canada, for example, Chrystia Freeland, who used to be the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, well, she's now Minister of Transportation of Canada. And if you're looking at these videos and if you're in the US and you think, well, I don't need to look at all the players' videos on the Rail Families United YouTube channel, because a lot of these are Canadian and they don't apply to me. Wrong. You do need to look at those because they absolutely do impact you, and you cannot get the full scope of the issues and understand how you're now impacted in the US unless you look at all of the videos I'm posting at Rail Families United on that YouTube channel and that website, RailFamiliesUnited.com. But, again, as an MA in finance, I'm here to tell you, when these rail executives sign off and say we're in compliance of all laws under which we operate, and they're really not, and they're lying to us as rail families, as rail investors, as rail customers, as taxpayers. Because, the other thing is, when you have railway investigation reports, which are nothing but rags of lies, as was the case in the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, and there's other rail investigation reports that I have huge issues with, you're lying to the public. So that's financial fraud. You're trying to portray yourself as a better company than what you really are. And if rail investors knew about fake qualifications and they knew about death cover-ups, would they be investing in your company? Would they trust the rail executives that are at the top of these companies? I seriously doubt it. There is nothing like a scandal that makes people run, and especially investors. And the Surface Transportation Board had better take its job very seriously. And, to say, oh, it's not my job to look at wrongdoing by rail executives. Well, whose job is it? And if those things come to light and you're at the Surface Transportation Board, do you not have a responsibility to the public to refer those issues to someone who would investigate them? You can't just wash your hands and say, willful ignorance is also a criminal offense. You can't just turn a blind eye. Oh, I didn't know. You're there as the Surface Transportation Board to look at issues, not just that are going to be given to you by rail customers and whatever when it comes to mergers, but also by members of the public. I'm a U.S. citizen. As a U.S. citizen, I gave the Surface Transportation Board issues which I thought were relevant, which they needed to be aware of. and that I was submitting that as a U.S. citizen to the Surface Transportation Board, because it clearly played into the issues of mergers and whether or not to allow them, etc., given the players, whatever. If you've got somebody that you think, oh, maybe this person might, maybe they should be in a courtroom instead of a boardroom, should that impact the Surface Transportation Board decisions in allowing a merger where this is the guy who's going to be the CEO of the new company? I think most rail investors would say yes. I think most taxpayers would say yes. So I'm sorry, Surface Transportation Board, but you can't just wash your hands and say, oh, wait, looking into, potential criminal acts or violations of laws by rail executives. That's not our job. Well, I'm sorry, but your job is to protect the public. And that means in all aspects of rail. And if that includes personnel issues or, operational excellence and practices used in the rail industry and so on, I think there's a lot of people who would say, yeah, U.S. Surface Transportation Board, you can't just turn a blind eye to it all. You should do something. You should have done something. And so I'm going to end this video here. But again, there's many, many, many more emails and files that went to the U.S. Surface Transportation Board. I just give you a flavor of them here. But again, no U.S. regulator or Canadian regulator or anyone has the right to use my copyrighted intellectual information, my files, my analysis, my whatever, without my written consent. You don't have the right to give it away to rail executives who are going to try and build a massive case to try and protect themselves. The facts are what they are, and that's clear. And, it's not lawsuits against me. I'm a nobody. I'm a mother of a frontline rail worker. So, you know what, folks? I'm going up against big, massive players because everybody else failed to do their jobs. And that's not right. I shouldn't have to be doing the job of Transport Canada for almost 10 years. The job of the Surface Transportation Board or the U.S. Federal Railway Administration or whatever. I'm just trying to protect my child and frontline rail workers. And I just see entirely too many people sweeping everything under the carpet. So on that one, I will end it here, and I will see you on the next one.